Hello, we are now on part 14 of our discussion of Read on Authority by JudgeSabo, going through Engels's debate with Bakunin and the general anarchist notions of authority. We have returned to Engels's argument and actually are now covering the damage that it does to Marxism, not just a disagreement and misrepresentation, for good or for ill, of the anarchist. While I have made some critiques of anarchists myself in the terms of this reading, I can tell you quite sincerely that almost none of them are in Engels's argument, and they don't really save Engels's argument here. And again, I want people to know that I am generally on Team Engels in the Marx Engels debates. When people try to separate the two out, I might find Engels a little bit more vulgar than Marx sometimes, a little bit more sophisticated on things that aren't economic, and definitely more urbane. But sometimes his arguments are just bad, and we need to admit that. Let's continue. This is JudgeSabo's piece, starting now. Workers' emancipation from the machine. In our analysis of On Authority, we saw Engels argued that the material conditions of production require combined action, such as a factory itself has authority. Let me rephrase that. We saw that Engels argued that the material conditions of production which require combined action, such as a factory itself has authority. Okay. Engels believes that this is not merely a product of a specific mode of production we live in, but asserts that it is a veritable despotism existing independent of all social organization. Asterisk. I'm just going to point out that seems to assume that the material conditions of production have a will. Otherwise, Engels has done an equivocation, but we've already talked about this a lot. Engels describes the socialist factory as a worker to be, in a sense, condemned to hell. We have also noted several ways which this can be understood are connected with the rest of Marxist analysis. If the authority of the machine just means that people need to adapt our actions to the particular conditions we find ourselves in, then anarchists fully recognize authority of this kind. But this is not. But not only does this not meet the anarchist definition of authority, it doesn't even meet Engels' definition. Yep, it does not. If authority is the imposition of the will upon another, what ghost has possessed this machine that it has a will to impose? Furthermore, our actions don't just conform to our material conditions when there is a machine involved, but to all circumstances. It is true that for the power of the loom to operate, people must perform particular actions, but it is equally true for that of the spinning wheel. It needs power to spin. Cotton has to be fed, waste needs to be removed, parts need to be replaced, and so on. This authority would exist independently of combined action, which would only be one form of it. Yet Engels presents the desire to abolish authority as a move from the power loom back to the spinning wheel. Perhaps this is why he has qualified it only as abolishing authority in large-scale industry? Question marks. Yeah, I've never understood this argument by Engels, because it doesn't. His analogy at the end doesn't even make sense. There is an authority coming from the meat of all individual tools to work a certain way too. That's not the scale of it. Yes, quality is affected by quantity, and in fact, quantity does eventually change quality in a fundamental way. I mean, that's a Hegelian insight that's actually kind of backed up by science. But this is not a big enough scale difference to change it. Not when you talk about the needs of making something work. Anyway, back to JudgeSabo. This seems to be closely related to what Bakunin recognizes the authority of the inevitable power of natural laws. As we saw, Bakunin happily recognized the authority of these laws, but without giving up the basic elements of his anarchism. It seems that anarchists would similarly have no issue recognizing the authority of the spinning wheels need to be fed cotton. This would obviously not qualify as an authority by a more standard anarchist definition, or asterisk, by almost anyone's definition, including Marx and Engels most of the time. It seems that Engels' view of authority of the factory, machine, and the authority of the delegate as inherently tied together is in some ways is in some fundamental way, because the factory requires large-scale combined action. It combines administrators. It requires administrators, and because Ingalls considers all administrators to be authorities, this means that the factory itself requires authority, leading Ingalls to describe the machinery itself as despotic. Asterisk. I mean, the fact that Ingalls was a factory shop manager and a child of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois himself, maybe sometimes here does actually seem to play here in his understanding in a way that's not particularly flattering, honestly. Back to the text. And before people go, that's an ad hominem. It's not an ad hominem if it's relevant to the argument. And homonyms are only ad hominems if they're irrelevant. All right. As we have seen, Ingalls misunderstood what anarchists meant by their critique of authority. Anarchists are able to propose methods of combined action and administration that are consistent with their anti-authoritarianism. This undermines the central thrust of his argument. If administrators need not be authoritarian, then the factory itself is not requiring authority. Any authority will be found in the factory will be dependent, not independent, of social organization. While it is clear how Ingalls' argument fails as a critique of anarchism here, we have not yet fully explored the ways in which it also undermines Marxism itself. We haven't, JudgeSabo, but you're right. I thought it does too, independently. We noted before how his view of authority of the machine and on authority is similar to, but still out of place from, the more standard Marxist analysis. Marx and Engels are no strangers to describing the factory as despotic within capitalism, as workers have been turned into mere appendages of the machine. But applying the same argument to socialist production seems strange. Furthermore, this form of impersonal dominion seems to be emphasized not as inherent characteristic of the object, but the consequence of the form of social organization. But here Engels emphasizes that the machine has authority, independent of all social organizations. Unlike other places where Marx and Engels describe authority as the authority of impersonal objects and systems, this authority is presented as an inherent characteristic. Asterisk. Transhistorically, even on asterisks. This seems to be the most major way in which an authority is inconsistent with Marxism. Anywhere else I've been able to find Marx and Engels describing impersonal forces of domination, this has always been the direct product of our forms of social organization, and it has been presented as a problem of which socialism would solve. I have seen Marxist scholars appear to come to similar conclusions as well. Robert C. Tucker noted that Engels' argument, quote, seems inconsistent with some of what we know of the thinking of Marx. This is accurate. Consider this section of Marx's Capital from 1867. Long quote from Capital. The lifelong speciality of holding one and the same tool now becomes the lifelong speciality of serving one and the same machine. Machinery is put to a wrong use, with the object of transforming the workman from his very childhood into a part of a detail machine. Ellipses. Here, as everywhere else, we must distinguish between the increased productiveness due to the development of the social process of production and that due to capitalist exploitation of the process. And handicrafts and manufacturer, workmen make use of tools. In the factory, the tools make use of him. Thus, the movements of the instrument of labor proceeded from him. Here it is the moments of the machine that he must follow. Here it is the movements of the machine that he must follow. And the manufacturer, the workmen are parts of a living mechanism. In the factory, we have a lifeless mechanism independent of the workman, who becomes its mere living appendage. Every kind of capitalist production, insofar as it is not only a labor process, but also a process of creating surplus value, has this in common. It is not the workman who employs the instruments of labor, but the instruments of labor employed the workmen. But it is only in the factory system that the inversion for the first time acquires a technical and palpable reality. By the means of its conversion into automation, the instrument of labor confronts the laborer during the labor process in the shape of capital, of dead labor that dominates, pumps dry, living labor power. Dead labor here is a product of prior labor. The prior labor is what created the machine. That is why it is dead labor. Okay. Dead labor is not normally a problem, but it's a problem in capitalism because it accelerates the dependency of the worker on the whole system and also makes them more precarious and more easy to be rendered lumpen. Back to the text. When Marx described the machine as despotic, this is what he means. As we can see, and this is a direct consequence of the system of capitalist exploitation. This alienation workers have from their own tools is directly derived from the workers' estranged labor, resulting in the worker being turned into a mere living appendage of the machine that dominates them. Thanks to the machine, work is simplified, becoming its own form of drudgery. The workers are now attending to the machine that does the work rather than seeing it as a product of their own hands. Workers that previously were molded to specialize in one particular craft are now molded to attend to one particular kind of machine through this being molded to it. This is especially clear in factory labor, but also generally true of all labor within capitalism. Asterisk. Yeah, I've felt that on a food prep line. An asterisk. Since production is aimed at surplus value rather than use values, the worker has been reduced to the status of a tool themselves. The factory just gives this a technical and palpable reality because you can see all the machines. We're back into where you can't see the machines. So, in some ways, my points that are beyond Judge Sabo's points here that we don't live in these conditions anymore anyway, and the Ingalls is misrecognizing that as well, still applies. All right, back to this. This aspect of capitalism is one of the main things socialism seeks to abolish. The workers' emancipation is aimed not merely against the despotism of capitalism, but the despotic machine ending our estranged labor. Yeah, we're not against machines themselves, but we're against the machines in their teleological function within capital. And that's a big difference. Why we're not primitivists. We also see this same idea in Marx's Grundrisse. Long quote. In fact, in the production of the process of capital, as will be seen more closely in the further development, labor is a totality, a combination of labors whose individual component parts are alien to one another, so that the overall process as a totality is not the work of an individual worker, and is furthermore the work of the different workers together only in the extent that they are forcibly combined and do not voluntarily enter combination with one another. This combination of this labor appears just as subservient to and led by an alien will and an alien intelligence, having its animated unity elsewhere, as its material unity appears to subordinate to the object unity of the machinery of fixed capital, which, as an alienated monster, objectifies a scientific idea and is in fact the coordinator, does not in any way relate to the individual worker as his instrument, but rather he himself exerts an animated individual punctuation mark as its living isolated accessory. Thus, combined labor is a combination in itself in a double way, not a combination of mutual relations along the individuals working together, nor is their predominance either over their particular or individual function or over the instrument of labor. Hence, just that the worker relates to the product of his labor as an alien thing, so does he relate to the combination of his labor as an alien combination, as well as to his own labor as an expression of his life. Although it belongs to him, it is alien to him and coerced from him, and which A. Smith, etc., A. Smith being Adam, therefore conceives is a burden, a sacrifice. Labor, like its product, is neglected as the labor of the particular isolated worker. Quote. Marx here is analyzing combined labor, equivalent to Engels' combined action, which in capitalist production is involuntary. Because the work is involuntary, the worker has become subordinated to a foreign will, which appears to be found in the machinery itself that they are made to serve as a, quote, animated individual punctuation mark. Marx even notes how the factory appears to have its own animating will and mind, things necessary for it to be an authority according to Engels' definition. But this apparent authority of the machine only exists because of our estranged labor in the production of capital. The labor is being involuntarily extracted from us as surplus labor needed to create surplus value. The authority of the machine is therefore not independent of all socialist organization, but the direct result of it. One would think that the bourgeois Engels would simply be unable to escape the view of his own class, and like so many capitalists before him, took the laws of his particular mode of production to the eternal laws of nature. But this would be false. Yeah, I was actually going to say that. Engels doesn't always sound bourgeois like this, but he does here. Engels absolutely knew better. Consider what he wrote in Anti-Düring. Long quote from Engels. One of the smarter parts of Anti-Düring, by the way. In making itself the master of all means of production to use them in accordance with a social plan, society puts an end to the former subjection of men to their own means of production. It goes without saying that society cannot free itself unless every individual is freed. The old mode of production must therefore be revolutionary from top to bottom, and in the particular, the former division of labor must disappear. Its place must be taken by an organization of the production in which, on one hand, no individual can throw on the shoulders of others his share in the productive labor, this natural condition of human existence, and in which, on the other hand, productive labor, instead of being the means of subjugating men, will become the means of their emancipation by offering each individual the opportunity to develop all his faculties, physical and mental, in all directions, and exercises them to the full, in which, therefore, productive labor will become a pleasure instead of being a burden. What a change of tone from an authority. The existence of a social plan of combined action is no longer seen as a sign of the worker's slavery to the machinery or anything or anyone else. Quite the opposite, as the existence of this social plan actually puts an end to the worker's subjection to the means of production. Engels goes out of his way to emphasize that this is true on the individual level. He agrees with the anarchist that social freedom can only be found when there's individual freedom, and that within social production, the means of production have become the means of the worker's emancipation. This is much more consistent and well-grounded position within Marxist thought on socialism, which seems to directly contradict on authority. Perhaps there's a way in which these positions can be brought into harmony. Engels has, after all, emphasized that the authority is confined to different spheres in socialism. Perhaps socialism abolishes the factory's authority of estranged labor in capitalist production, but retains its with regard to the hours of work for planning combined action. The authority of the factory could be abolished in one sense, but not in another. This kind of response seems to have little hope, though. The machine is only able to appear as an authority due to the estrangement the workers had from their labor and from each other when engaging in combined action within capitalist production. The relation of the workers to their delegates would need to be similarly estranged for the machine to take the appearance of authority. I actually agree with this, and this is a very subtle and smart reading on JudgeSabo of the actual Marxist text, of which Engels is basically contradicting himself. This is no longer the case within socialism, goal of which is the unalienated human being, unless you're Althusser, in which alienation is not the case, is not considered the point. I wish Marx is the best of luck in squaring this circle if they can, and I don't think they can. I don't think we can. On that note, we're going to end. We have one more section, and we'll do that soon. Actually, let's go ahead and do it. No, let's not go ahead and do it. All right. Capitalist present, anarchism and the authority of revolution. Typically, when authority is cited for support by Marxists, the bulk of Engels' argument is ignored. Yep, I've noticed it too. The connection between authority and coercion is too intuitive, too natural for Marxists to deny it. If they were to insist that after the emancipation of the working class, socialist production will remain authoritarian in relation to the workers, too many uncomfortable questions are raised. This essay would stop being rhetorically useful for a quick dismissal of anarchism. Instead, almost all the discussion focuses on the need of violence and revolution. Yeah, which is funny because it's like mentioned once. On authority is reduced from 4 pages down to a single paragraph and maybe 2 quips. A paragraph, we should note, where Engels assumed all socialists already knew and agreed with his position, and therefore did not require elaboration. Engels is extremely confused by the anarchist stance, and even seems to present the Marxist stance as a way to placate them. The state, which they hate so much, will be destroyed, if only given enough time, and the more permanently, since the plan destroys the root cause of the state in the process. But Engels conflates the necessity of the state with the necessity of using violence and revolution. This is because for Engels, all violence is authoritarian, in which case I actually kind of agree that all violence is authoritarian, even offensive violence, but nonetheless. And any organized fighting force on behalf of some class is a state. I actually also think Engels is not entirely wrong there. I would say any organized fighting force on behalf of some class is a state if they require the use of specific surplus value and do not make it themselves. Even if he later admits that this is not a state in the truest sense of the term. I'm going to go quote State and Revolution by Lenin. on this one. For the proletariat, this is their own dictatorship, which seizes the means of production from the capitalists and defends itself from counter-revolution. Yep. Since any such force would qualify as a state, the anarchist, by rejecting the state, must be rejecting violence itself. I don't even think that, though. That's the leap I don't follow. Like, if all violence is authoritarian and any organized force of class is a class of a state, the two things are not necessarily linked, even if those two statements are true. So even though I would probably disagree with JudgeSabo that Ingles' two assertions are somehow false, I would agree with him that they still don't flow. That they can do this while still calling for a revolution completely baffles Ingles, who only questions whether or not anarchists have seen a revolution in the first place, which is a good quip, but it's also just a quip. The answer is, of course, yes, anarchists have seen revolutions and engaged in many of them, including figures like Louis Michel and Paris Commune, the very example of revolutions that Engels used. Bakunin, as the main target of Engels' critique, had personally left to join the January uprising in Poland in 1863, and in September of 1870 launched a quickly defeated insurrection in Lyon. Let's also remit that Bakunin and Engels fought together, roughly together, although not directly together, in 1848. Marx didn't, but that's neither here nor there. Engels actually wrote on authority while the idea of propaganda of the deed was becoming increasingly popular within the anarchist movement. The propaganda of the deed is actually one of the elements of anarchism that I think is dangerous. So, supporting a whole series of violence and insurrectionary attempts. And the reason why I think the propaganda of the deed is dangerous is because we see it in lone wolf acts of right-wing terrorism. It actually seems to reinforce the status quo. This is a critique that Lenin made, and one that I think is accurate. I don't think the propaganda of the deed is necessary for anarchism or even direct action. It was just definitely a thing at the time. As the anarchist movement grew, it became more and more involved in revolutionary movements at larger scales, including the Malkovich Black Army during the Russian Revolution, or the CNT-FAI during the Spanish Civil War. I agree with you, but I kind of like, can you guys talk about some other examples? Because those are two basic ones. Anyway, the anarchist support for insurrection and revolutionary violence was quite obvious, even at the time. Engels was deliberately ignored or misrepresented this aspect of his opponents. And in fact, in other places, Marx and Engels actually criticized anarchists for being too violent. So I don't get the point here. Engels' error once again comes down to his fundamental misrepresentation of the anarchist critique of authority. While anarchists do not recognize coercion as an essential element of authority, the use of coercive methods alone is not enough to qualify as authority. I mean, that seems like hair splitting, but whatever. Authority for anarchists is not merely the use of certain methods, rifles, bayonets, and cannons, but the coercion that fulfills a particular function in establishing and maintaining relations of domination and exploitation, imposing and exercising class privilege and monopoly. I mean, I do think that's what anarchists think. I don't know that that's actually a super valid argument. Authoritarian violence is therefore quite unlike anti-authoritarian resistance. Sort of. Whereas authority introduces coercion into social relationships, evading the freedom and equity of others, the violence of resistance is a reaction against its invasion. But it's a reaction against this invasion that uses violent means and as a use of counterforce. So I still think this part of the argument's fairly. This is one of the things that JudgeSabo asserts. I just think the anarchists are. It's kind of splitting hairs here. It also serves precisely the opposite function. The aim of the slave rebellion is not the enslavement of the former masters. Sometimes. Usually it's not. It's not always not. As if the system were kept in place, but with people's positions shuffled around by the end of slavery itself. Usually I would agree with you, but that's not always true. Like, I would be very careful of like saying something like this as a historical generalization. Because of this relatively narrow conception of authority, there's no contradiction in the anarchists denouncing all authority while supporting violence used in self-defense, as in the revolution of the oppressed. Okay, but the revolution of the oppressed is also a preemptive strike, so that actually complicates the argument. All right. Anyway, I'm actually not willing to fall on this hill. I think this part of the argument is still somewhat silly by Ingalls, but this is the one thing that I'm somewhat sympathetic to, which is why so many people invoke it instead of the majority of the essay, which is way weaker and self-contradictory. Because of this relatively narrow conception of authority, there's no contradiction in anarchists denouncing authority and supporting violence using self-defense and a revolution of the oppressed. We have consistently seen anarchism recognize the role of violence when used to defend against invasion and the violence of authoritarians, such as Bakunin's federalism, socialism, anti-theologism, Malatestier's anarchy, Reclus's anarchy, Alexander Bergman's Now and After, the ABCs of Communist Anarchism. To add one more clear example, Malatesta argued for this in his anarchist program in 1920. Leaving aside the lessons of history, which demonstrate that never has a privileged class divested itself of some of all of its privileges, of all or some of its privileges. It has, I'm going to actually say, never has a privileged class divested itself of all of its privileges. It has divested itself of some of its privileges, dude. And never has a government abandoned power unless obliged to by force or by fear of force. Oh, that latter is actually pretty important. By fear of force. There is enough contemporary evidence to convince anyone that the bourgeoisie and governments is intended to use armed force to defend themselves, not only against complete expropriation, but equally against the smallest popular demands. I mean, we can see this right now in people unnecessarily crushing Gaza protests and are always ready to engage in the most atrocious prosecutions and the bloodiest massacres. For those people who want to emancipate themselves, only one course is open, that of opposing force with force. I mean, I don't disagree with that, honestly, but nonetheless. It is worth noting that Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, who is often identified as an anarcho-pacifist or a Christian anarchist rejecting violence even in self-defense according to the Nazarene command to turn the other cheek, did not self-identify as an anarchist precisely because he saw it as calling for violent revolution. This can be seen in his essay on anarchy. The anarchists are right in everything in the negation of the existing order and the assertion that without authority there could be no worse violence than that of authority under existing conditions. They are mistaken only in thinking that anarchy can be instituted by violent revolution. Clearly, while Tolstoy did not consider anarchy as a proper goal, he disagreed with the anarchist who considered himself distinct from whom he considered him distinct from himself precisely because they did recognize the need for violence. If we do include pacifists like Tolstoy among the ranks of anarchists, they were a small minority. Yep. There is no small amount of irony that he viewed the anarchists this way, given how frequently they are portrayed as dangerous, bomb-throwing, violent outlaws and bandits. As we have seen, Ingalls was both incorrect about how anarchists defined authority and whether or not they oppose violent resistance to oppression. I don't think Ingalls really believes his own argument here because it's actually not consistent with other arguments he makes elsewhere. Perhaps one contributing factor in this is that Ingalls, like Marx and the political indifferentism, was just recycling old arguments against Proudhon instead of actually engaging with the arguments put forth by the collectivist anarchist. Part of this confusion seems to come from the anarchist call for abstentionism. We saw this before in Marx treating a call for abstention from political activity as equivalent to the rejection of the need for violence. Anarchists disputed this characterization even at the time. For example, Bakunin wrote this in a letter to Anselmo Lorenzo in May 1872. The Marxians accuse us of intentionally ignoring political struggles, thus they represent us falsely as a species of Acadian, Platonic, pacifist socialists who are in no way revolutionary. In saying this of us, they lie deliberately, for they know better than anyone else that we too have the urge, the proletariat, to engage with the political question, but that the politics we preach, absolutely populist and internationalist, not nationalist and bourgeois, has its goal not the foundations of the transformation of states, but their destruction. We say, and all that we witness today in Germany and Switzerland confirms this, that the politics aimed at the transformation of states in the so-called populist sense can only end up in use subjugation of the proletariat to the profit of the bourgeois. Elsewhere, Bakunin goes into more detail about what he means by abstention and the anarchist approach to political activity. It is not true to say that we completely ignore politics. We do not ignore it, for we definitely want to destroy it. And here we have essential points separating us from the political parties and the bourgeois radical socialists. Their politics consist in making use of, reforming, and transforming the politics of the state, whereas our politics, the only kind we admit, is a total abolition of the state and of the politics which is its necessary manifestation. And only because we frankly want the abolition of politics do we believe that we have a right to call ourselves internationalists and revolutionary socialists. For he who wants to pursue the politics of a different kind, who does not aim with us at the total abolition of politics, he must accept the politics of the state, patriotic and bourgeois politics, and that is to deny in the same and in the name of his great or small national state, the human solidarity of nations beyond the pale of the particular state, as well as the economic and social emancipation of the masses within the state. Bakunin and the anarchists call for the abstention from politics could be more accurately understood as abstention from participating within bourgeois political institutions, something that Marxists sometimes do too, depending on which ones you are and when you're talking about. First and foremost, being the state. As an alternative, the advocate for building a truly proletarian institution outside of and opposed to the state and of capital, it was not, as Marx and Engels would characterize it, a call for workers to ignore political matters. Having seen that anarchists can both use violence and form larger organizational structures, it is unsurprising to see that that these have been applied within revolutionary anarchist organizations. Nor would they consider such organizations to be a state, just as Engels used a far broader definition of authority to include things anarchists would support. So too did he use a broader definition of the state, at least before he stated advocating the word he'd be replaced with commonality in regard to the so-called people state. Zoe Baker represents the anarchist understanding of a state like this. Actual states are institutions that one, perform the function of reproducing power of the economic ruling classes, two, are hierarchical and culturally organized, and three, are wielded by a minority of political ruling classes who sit at the top of the state hierarchy and possess the authority to make laws and issue commands at a societal level that others must obey due to the threat or exercise of institutional force. In other words, authority as anarchists defined it is also an essential part of the state. The state is necessarily an hierarchical institution concentrating power into the hands of the economic and political elites, in contrast to the bottom-up form of organizing we've seen from anarchists. The flaw in Engels' reasoning then can be once again largely traced to this distinction in definitions. He misunderstands the anarchist critique of authority and therefore also misunderstood their critique of the state by extension. This is also why Engels' objection that the anarchists want to get rid of the state before the social conditions that gave birth to it have been destroyed is similarly flawed. Anarchists do not consider it important that we one day achieve I missed a key word there. Anarchists did not only consider it important that we one day achieve a society with authority, they also believe that to achieve such a society, we need to actually put these ideas into practice today, prefiguring the world that we want in a manner that we organize now. This is a fundamental difference between Marxists and anarchists, although there are prefigurativists amongst Marxists, because Marxists will argue we cannot know the conditions of the future, so trying to prefigure them totally is kind of problematic, if not impossible. And that is a critique I'm somewhat sympathetic to. Through the revolutionary and transformative practice of direct action, we develop the confidence, drive, skills, and networks and relations to allow this capitalist society to be born, building the new in the shell of the old, and produce and reproduce the kinds of people fit to live within it. If we were to introduce authority as our organizational structures, we would not only fail to achieve the society we want by utilizing ineffective means, producing a different kind of world than we intended to build, but would ourselves be corrupted by engaging in the wrong kinds of practices, developing the wrong kinds of drives and capacities. This I'm more sympathetic to the prefigured argument about. So on one hand, I don't think we can perfectly prefigure the world we want. On the other hand, I think if we cynically try to square a circle, what we end up doing is reproducing capacities that we don't want in future instantiations, which is why so many politics are degenerative over time. All right. Thus, both the new socialist rulers and the people they rule over would be corrupted. Recreating the system they sought to abolish. This, and not the existence of defensive violence, is the reason anarchists oppose utilizing state power. Anarchist theory resonated with Audre Lorde's conclusion that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. I'm not sure that that's actually logically true. Like, even as a metaphor. This is Audre Lorde quote that everyone loves that I've always thought was deeply flawed. Anarchists are not distinguishing between authoritarian and non-authoritarian violence merely on moral grounds, even if they do also happen to consider slavery immoral, but also upon this new material class analysis and a theory of social change learned from experience. This is not to say that anarchists will accept organizations of any kind so long as they have a reasonable claim of self-defense. For example, anarchists are overwhelmingly opposed to prisons, as am I. We have also seen this kind of organizational structure anarchists demand in a bit more detail above using free association federation, but also allow us need to be adopted for the questions of communal defense. We have seen a focus on rehabilitation and respect for humanity, even in situations when faced with situations where the choices are to kill or be killed. Anarchists recognize the need to respond to antisocial acts, attacking the freedom and equity of others, but attempts to find proper response that do not require the creation of an antisocial system. If it would be worth having a more full discussion of anarchist criminology, for lack of a better term. Yeah, I mean, this is why I talk about if you're serious about abolishing the police, you're actually calling for a universal militia. So, which I would not be against. All right. For now, it is enough to point out that anarchists do recognize the need for violence within revolutions, and that because they do not ignore class and the overall oppressive structure of the workers find themselves in, do not contradict themselves in recognizing this. To quote Enrico Malatesta, quote, "We are in principle opposed to violence, and for this reason wish the social struggle should be conducted as humanely as possible. But this does not mean that we would wish it to be less determined, less thorough going. Indeed, we are of the opinion that in the long run, half measures are only indefinitely prolong the struggle, neutralizing it as well as encouraging more of the kind of violence which one wishes to avoid. Neither does it mean that we limit the right of self-defense to resistance against actual or inanimate attack. For us, the oppressed are always in a state of legitimate defense and are fully justified in rising without waiting to actually be fired on." This is a part that makes it a little questionable about preemptive right. And we're fully aware of the fact that an attack is often the best means of defense. By contrast, it's actually astonishing how little Engels discusses class within on authority. Yeah, I also find that weird. Even when he is describing a revolution, he fails to mention the existence of the ruling class being revolted against. Quote, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is an act whereby one part of the population imposes will upon another part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannons. Authoritarian means if such were to be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain rule by means of terror, which its arms inspire in the reactionists." I mean, that the love of terror that you hear out of this time period, I do think is across the board, not just in Eagles. You get it in Trotsky. Is actually a sign, as Kotsky criticized Trotsky for, of a minority rule trying to impose itself upon a majority. If you are outnumbered, you have a reason to normalize yourself to the masses. Particularly if you don't have a means or power or weaponry to suppress them. This description of a revolution is so neutral it can easily apply to the actions of the ruling classes themselves trying to put down the rebellion. Yeah, but Engels is actually trying to make a paradigmatic or Platonic point. The revolution here can be seen as no different from any other war between states, between one part of the population against the other, as each side uses violence to claim victory. This is because, for Engels, class is irrelevant to authority. Authority is merely a matter of one party imposing itself on the other, and however Engels is defining this, he considers resisting oppression to be a form of imposing oneself on the oppressor. Well, if you resist it preemptively, you are imposing yourself. I don't think you can play word games around that. All right, this is perhaps easy enough to understand when we ignore the overall context and class analysis. An individual case of revolutionary violence would certainly be seen as authoritarian, with the rebel holding an enemy combatant at gunpoint and demanding they surrender. The revolutionary holding the enemy combatant at gunpoint and demanding they lay down their arms would be imposing themselves upon the gendarme, acting as an authority to the authorities. I mean, they are. I don't think that's actually particularly ironic or anything weird. I think that's what's going on. It's, you could argue that it's a temporary authority as opposed to a permanent one, and I do think that's true. The gendarme who disarms himself and you don't have to shoot them and either neutralizes themselves or joins you, you have enforced authority upon them, but now they are themselves moved into authority, and once everyone is into that authority, there is no more authority anymore. Maybe that's my Marxist dialectical reasoning kicking in, but that's the way I would view it. Okay, we have another irony here that Marxists are so ready to compare anarchism unfavorably to liberalism because of supposed moralizing. I don't think it's supposed. I think the better argument is Marxist moralize too, they just hide it. But this is a class-blind view which equates the violence of people against their oppressor with their oppression, with the oppression itself, seems more familiar to the liberal. Because by anarchist analysis, authority is deeply connected not only with coercion, but also with imposing social relations of domination and exploitation. The violent resistance against authority is not itself authoritarian. It is a defensive violence that does not stop at just disarming one's opponent is a form of domination, and I don't think you can get around that by language games. Most of what Engels does is a language game, but I think a lot of the responses to this are themselves language games. And I know, JudgeSabo comments on these themselves, so we'll see. But I know this is where I'm sympathetic to the anarchist cause here, but I actually just think this is not a great way to argue it. The violent resistance against authority is not a self-authoritarian. Anarchists view this as a self-evident. Yeah, but okay, anything that's viewed as self-evident, you can already take as an ideological claim. Nothing is self-evident. Okay, as recluse, I don't know how you say that, suggested that, quote, no one goes so far as to consider the revolutionary stance against power as a true representative of authority. No, but they are acting with authority in that instance and then giving it up. This is exactly the position that Engels advanced. Yes. The point here is not to determine which definition is correct. Thank you, because we can't. Language is made up. I mean, sort of. And words can take on different meanings in different contexts. Absolutely. Engels is not wrong per se for considering all violence authoritarian. Thank you. He can define his terms however he likes, but he's wrong in misrepresenting how others define their terms and misrepresenting their position as extensive as that. Okay, JudgeSabo, back on your side. That's absolutely correct. All right, anarchists define their terms as they do out of convenience and for precision, not out of necessity, as if their points were merely semantic. If the anarchists needed to adopt a broader Marxist conception of authority in the state, it would still be possible for them to express their same core position. Yes, it would. Absolutely. And there's a lot of people on the left-wing Marxism that would actually come to a very similar conclusion. Right. Consider Enrico Malatesta's letter to Luigi Febri from July 1919 regarding the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat, which some anarchists have been adopting after the Russian Revolution. Quote, but perhaps the truth is simply this. Our old Bolshevist friends intend with the expression dictatorship of the proletariat merely the revolutionary act of the workers taking possession of the land and the instruments of labor and trying to constitute a society for organizing a mode of life in which there would be no place for a class that has exploited and oppressed the producers. Yes, that is what I think it means. See Hal Draper's book on the dictatorship of the proletariat. As understood so, the dictatorship of the proletariat would be an effective power of the workers intent on breaking down the capitalist society, and it would become anarchy immediately upon the cessation of revolutionary resistance. Yes, that's actually the Marxist position, I think. That's how I've always understood it. I've always considered a slightly slower anarchist, but a lot of Marxists disagree with me, but that's like my reading of what we are. And no one would attempt by force to make the masses obey him and work for him. Then our dissent would have only to do with words. The dictatorship of the proletariat is simply a dictatorship of all, which certainly does not mean a dictatorship, as a government of all is no longer a government in the authoritarian, historic, and practical sense of the word. This is the way I've understood it. I've actually thought dictatorship of the proletariat is an unfortunate phrasing because it's ambivalent, as Draper points out, because it can be interpreted as a dictatorship for the proletariat in either a person or a party, or a dictatorship of the proletariat over all people who were not of the proletariat when they ruled, not even if they're proletarianized later, as sometimes was done in Maoist caste systems, for example. Where class origins deemed your entire future viability, regardless of what you did later on. No, I think that Malatesta is right. And I actually think that's what I mean when I use the word dictatorship of the proletariat. That's what I hope for. Here we can see how, because of how these terms have been defined, Malatesta took a position much closer to that of Engels, even recognizing that the state would wither away once reactionary resistance had ended. Yep. Thank you, Malatesta. This could be a dictatorship that he would support precisely because he would not consider it a dictatorship at all. It included all the workers, not just the proletariat as the Marxists understand them, and would have no ruling class which to make laws for the masses. No, because everyone's proletarianized. That's the idea. Malatesta's opposition to the Bolsheviks was indeed not rooted in them calling themselves a dictatorship, which, as he points out, would have only been a matter of semantics, precisely because they do not match this conception. They would be a dictatorship, not of the proletariat, but of their party. He continues. But the true partisans of the dictatorship of the proletariat do not understand the word so, as they have shown in Russia. Obviously, the proletariat comes into, as the people come into democratic regimes, that is to say, simply for the purpose of concealing the true essence of things. In reality, one sees the dictatorship of the party, or rather the heads of the party, and it is a true dictatorship, with its decrees, its penal laws, its executive agents, and above all, its armed force that serves today to defend the revolution from external enemies, but will serve tomorrow to impose upon the workers the will of the dictators to arrest revolution, to consolidate new interests, and finally defend a new privileged class against the masses. And I gotta say, by 1936, even with popular legitimacy, and I actually do think the purges had popular legitimacy, even if they were aimed at people who were fundamentally innocent, Malatesta's right. He's right. It did go that way. At the thought of an authority, Engels argued that anarchists oppose authority because the word sounds bad. And here we can see that is not the case. Malatesta's position is not based on the word, on how the word sounds. Yeah, although I will say that invoking Malatesta here is difficult since that was written 40 years after, or 50 years after On Authority was written. So, but I still see the point. I just think, it would be better to find something like that in Bakunin. But upon the actual theory of the practice and organizing, although I don't think dictatorship of the proletariat was normally used even by Marxists when Bakunin was around. I mean, it was by the commentary on the Commune. Most of the arguments about dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx had was actually with Branchius, who had a different definition of it. Anyway, they typically do not do this, not only because it is a terrible rhetorical strategy, because it's misleading and makes the terminology less precise. We can actually see an example of this in Bakunin. Okay, thank you. Prior to the publication of the On Authority, on 2 occasions he described the kind of revolutionary organizations he wanted to organize as kinds of dictatorship. Yeah, in fact, Marx and Engels used that against him in other places. His April 1870 letter to Albert Richard and his June 1870 letter to Sergei Nechayev. It's a bit debatable whether Nechayev is a state socialist, but okay. Both letters were addressed to state socialists, which is part of the reason he did this, contrasting the overt dictatorships they purported to as secret or invisible ones. Yeah, Bakunin's correspondence with Nechayev is a problem, and it's one that I wish Sabo would probably talk about more, because it ends up pretty ugly. All right. While these letters are sometimes used in bad faith as supposed evidence of Bakunin's conspiracy to consolidate power in himself within the First International, yeah, I've heard them used that way. I don't think that's what they mean, but I can see how you can make them mean that. The actual letters make it clear that precisely what makes these organizations different from the other ones is that they worked not for issuing orders or commands to the masses, but through persuasion and organizing, lacking any privileged position, and therefore do not threaten the liberty of the people. Bakunin's position here is not meaningfully different from that which he expressed elsewhere, except in jargon, and his motive for using the jargon here is also clear when we consider his target audience. Yeah, somebody's read a book on Bakunin's relationship to Sergei Nekhyev, because that's often something Marxists throw at him, and it's actually kind of an embarrassing thing for Bakunin. But nonetheless, anarchists have not opposed the existence of an armed force per se, and in fact seem to call on one to carry out insurrection. If that is enough to qualify as a state or a dictatorship in the eyes of some, then anarchists might object for the sake of clarity, but they are not disturbed by the word sounding bad. I'm actually disturbed that we use dictatorship of the proletariat, because it not just sounds bad, but the sounding bad has implications that lead people for sound misunderstandings and endorsing things that like red Bonapartism or something dumb like that. Anarchists have, in fact, considered the material conditions that have caused the state to arise against the Marxists. Anarchists seem to emphasize the dialectical relations between the state and the economic ruling classes, rather than seeing it as purely an outgrowth of those classes. I'm not sure that Marxists actually do see it as purely an outgrowth of those classes, but it is one of those things where I'm unclear. Well, I'm not sure that Marx actually sees it that way, but I think that there's an ambiguity in Marx's writing here, and I don't think it's easy to deal with. I think a lot of Marxists read that ambiguity in whichever way they feel convenient at any given time. Anarchists recognize the need for violence within the revolution, and thus did not contradict the demand for workers focused on abolishing authority, abolishing the force that dominates and exploits them as quickly as possible. Yeah, in some ways, the distinction between anarchists and Marxists is how quickly they thought this was possible. Because the anarchist theory of unity of means and ends, that is a difference. Anarchists recognize that revolutionary organizations we form to fight against the oppressors must not be built upon the principle of authority itself, as it would render it unsuitable and incapable of realizing an anti-authoritarian society. And instead, if we were successful in overthrowing the existing regime, it would not produce socialism, but would instead recreate a new system of domination and exploitation, or reintroduce old ones. Instead of revolutionary organizations, we must prefigure in a form of the type of society we want to achieve, built upon the principles of free agreement and federation. Whew. I'm a believer in concentric authorities and competing authorities within a system of equality, which means that what I would talk about is something like federation, but I don't think federation is actually the best model for it. I think it's one that's created by limited prior technology. But nonetheless, I understand what anarchists meant. Just like I understand Marx's concern for centralization and efficiency, which I think is important. But I also understand why it becomes a problem, because they don't consider brittleness or cascade failure, again, a problem. All this is to say that in some ways I've always been struck between the Marxists and the anarchists, as both have been right about the flaws in the other. And thus Marxists and anarchists blaming each other for certain flaws, when really a lot of the flaws are internal to ourselves, are actually imposed upon us by our enemies, like our actual enemies out there, the bourgeois, etc. It's harder to understand why we ended up so broken and opposed to one another. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell, read JudgeSabo's text. I know we're almost through that. We have one more episode and we will be done, and I will be reading other things. I still plan on covering I'm going to finish my series, which is a bunch of articles and stuff about Bourdieu and the Lyon thesis. So you guys want to know why I'm doing that, I'm writing a paper, a chapter in my book that's also going to be published as an essay for Strange Matters magazine on the modern use of Bourdieu post-Occupy and the history that led to that, and what I think is the reasons why it happened. But in doing that, I've actually rediscovered things I respected about Bourdieu, as well as things I disagree with. So we have that series. I'm taking a break from the Nailing It Down, because frankly, a lot of you don't watch them. But also, I need to find the other mentions of Critique of the Goethe program in the 1950s and 60s. I can't find hardly anything that mentions either Critique of the Goethe program or State and Revolution in the 30s and 40s, other than the Soviet Constitution itself, and that's only indirectly and implicitly. I find that interesting and weird, but probably understandable in a way that, like, parts of State and Revolution and Critique of the Goethe program actually complicate things claimed by socialist regimes, even if they were using that framework. So I'm doing research to figure out which texts I need to cover before I get to the secondary text by people like Lars Lee and Kevin Anderson, etc. So we will pick that up on Nailing It Down, but it's going to be a little while. And on that note, take care, guard your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and if you want to get more of this, you can find me on Patreon.